the Judaic Studies program, the History Department, and the Department of African American Studies, who all helped advertise this event. And of course, thanks to our three speakers, who I will introduce in a few moments. My name is David Weinfeld. For those of you who don't know, I am the professor of religious studies here at VCU. I'm also the Harry Lyons Chair of Judaic Studies, and I'm a historian by training, and much of my scholarship has dealt with the topic of quote unquote Black-Jewish relations, which is actually quite a popular topic of scholarly research. So when I arrived at VCU, I decided that to honor Black History Month, each February I would arrange a talk or event concerning Black-Jewish relations, broadly construed. So 2 years ago, some of you might remember that we had Dr. Danielle Christmas, who's a professor of English at UNC Chapel Hill, and she compared cinematic representations of the Holocaust to cinematic representations of slavery, which was really fascinating, especially in the television show American Horror Story. Last year, we had Dr. Charles Chavis Jr., historian at George Mason University, who came to speak to us about the civil rights activism of Rabbi Edward Israel. And what's especially interesting about that is it was civil rights activism in the 1920s and 1930s. So before what is commonly thought of as the height of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. It was very, very interesting. This year I decided that we should do something different, partly because of COVID, and partly just because I thought it would be interesting. And it occurred to me that we've had these two events on Black-Jewish relations, but of course it's becoming more and more clear that the topic Black-Jewish relations presents something of a false dichotomy, because many Jews are Black and many Black people are Jews. And this has always been true. But in the past few decades, it's become more and more true in the North American context. So I've convened a panel of three fantastic speakers who will share their thoughts, experiences, and analyses on the topic of Black Jews in North America. Our first speaker, joining us from San Francisco, is Rebecca Pierce. Rebecca is a filmmaker and writer from San Francisco and a contributing writer for Jewish Currents, which is a revitalized and very impressive left-wing Jewish journal. Her writing has been published in the New Republic, The Forward, The Nation, and Plus 972 magazine. Her documentary short films deal with a variety of topics concerning Israel and Palestine, including African asylum seekers in Israel and Ethiopian Israeli refuseniks from the military. Our second speaker, Tema Smith, joins us from Toronto, for which those of you who don't know is the most diverse city in the world and includes 200,000 Jews, making it one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. This is part of the reason that this panel is on Black Jews in North America, not just the United States. Of course, it doesn't hurt that I'm from Montreal myself. Tema Smith is a diversity advocate, educator, writer, and Jewish community builder, formerly the director of community engagement at Holy Blossom Forum Synagogue in Toronto. She's currently the director of professional development at the Jewish organization 18 Doors and a contributing columnist at The Forward. And apparently more than once she has been called, and I quote, the nicest person on Twitter. And last but certainly not least, we have Sherrina Gibson, who joins us from right here in Richmond, to provide some local perspective. Sherrina is a member of Temple Beth El, a conservative synagogue here in Richmond, where I am also a member. And Sherrina advocates for racial, disability, and other inclusion efforts within the synagogue and greater Richmond community. She is an expert in healthcare data analysis and program evaluation, and currently works as the senior analytics manager at a healthcare strategy consulting firm. So those are our three speakers for tonight. They're each going to speak for probably about 10 minutes. And after that, I may ask a question or two to get things rolling. But then, of course, we will open it up to the audience for Q&A. So should be a really fascinating evening. And why don't you take it away, Rebecca?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel. And during Black History Month, it's exciting to get to have this conversation. Just a little bit of background about myself. You know, there are many different ways to be Black and Jewish. For me, how I came into that identity is I come from an interfaith and interracial family. My parents are both civil rights attorneys who grew up in Chicago. So that's a big part of my Black Jewish background, is that sort of, you know, cultural background, although I am born and raised in California. And for me, growing up in a family where, you know, there were multiple religions, multiple faiths being practiced, in addition to like my mom's family being Christian, there's also Muslims on that side of my family. I just grew up in an environment where it was very normal to just practice pluralism, sort of in an everyday sort of environment and in a Jewish context. For me, holidays like Passover were really important for me growing up. There were some of my first actually kind of speaking engagements actually were at a freedom Seder in my community, where the Black community and the Jewish community came together to celebrate both Passover and also emancipation. And that was actually the first time I ever, I think, talked about race in front of a Jewish audience, when I was sort of describing my experiences of racism at my school. I was about 9 years old, and I think there's a story still in like our local Jewish newspaper about that. So for me growing up, you know, with two civil rights attorney parents, but my idea of Blackness and my idea of Jewishness are very connected to social responsibility, to fighting for human rights. You know, my dad was really involved in the Boycott Burma movement, something that he was, you know, influenced to join because of our family history of fleeing oppression. And my mom does a lot of work on housing discrimination. And so for me, some of the ways that I first learned about anti-Semitism were through her, you know, teaching me about racially restrictive housing covenants, which are agreements that are made, you know, like with the deed of a house, and they can actually exclude people, or like historically have excluded people, including both African Americans and in some cases Jews. And so for me, this kind of helped me understand the systemic and foundational ways that anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are connected in the US. And through my journey as a filmmaker, I've also found a lot of, you know, connections in different relationships through this. One of the films that really influenced me as a filmmaker is a documentary called Cicero March, which is a verite film that follows a Black civil rights protest against racially restrictive housing covenants and ordinances in Cicero, Illinois. And the counter protesters at that march were in many cases neo-Nazis. And this was in the era leading up to, you know, the Skokie attempt, you know, the Nazi march in Skokie that my dad protested as a youth. And so for me, even as I'm starting to get into film and to learn about the kind of things that I want to make films about, which are human rights and racial justice struggle, I'm already sort of seeing a connection between Black and Jewish history in that. In my work today, I do a lot of writing around what we term Black Jewish relations, which is actually something that like I both employ in my writing and also kind of want to push back on for the same reasons that David mentioned. You know, the idea that these are two separate communities, of course, has never been entirely true. There are people in between them, and there are many people like Black folks who are not necessarily mixed, who are Jewish, who have their own Jewish backgrounds, you know, going back for a very long time generationally. But at the same time, it's almost a constant hot button issue in American politics. And I think there are some complicated reasons for that. And Black Jews have a lot to say, I think, in these moments. And sometimes we're sort of forced to be a mediator in a way that's not fair, but that's also something I kind of embrace. One of the things that I really want to give Black Jewish organizers credit for is the response to the Women's March controversy. Y'all may remember a few years ago, there's controversy over some of the Women's March leadership, including Tamika Mallory, having relationships and like positive relationships with Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, which, as we know, is an organization that espouses like pretty anti-Semitic views. And what got lost in the discussion after the Women's March controversy was that the next year there was a group of, a group called Jewish Women of Color Marching that was led by Black Jewish women who really brought anti-Semitism and racial justice together to the fore of that march. There's a very iconic image of Shahana McKinney-Balden marching with the Torah in the Women's March, and it's so beautiful and powerful. And that really got lost. And so when you hear like a lot of our Jewish communal organizations talk about the Women's March, they very rarely give credit to these Black Jewish women who were able to push back on this issue with Farrakhan. Also, Tamika Mallory, after being in discussion with them, went on the Breakfast Club, which is like a very popular like radio show, like a lot of folks in the Black community listen to, and talked very seriously about anti-Semitism and the need to fight it. And that's actually like, that's the kind of transformation that you want to see after a conflict between two communities, right? Is this sort of reflection and someone actually taking a stand in a place where they've maybe, failed to in the past. So I think for me, a lot of my work as a writer is sort of bringing focus to these issues, and also the ways that, issues of racism and white supremacy are unfortunately still very prevalent in the Jewish community. Last year, when the Black Lives Matter protests were first popping off in response to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and also the Central Park case of the guy who was birding and a white woman threatened to call the police on him, I wrote a piece called, dealing with the fact that many Jewish institutions unfortunately function as what we refer to as white space, where the presence of people of color is assumed to be anomalous, where we're often sort of questioned why we're there and sometimes threatened. So I discussed sort of the issues of being a Black person in like Jewish communal spaces. I myself have unfortunately experienced some discrimination and racism. A lot of that comes online, but for more visibly Black people, again, I'm like a light-skinned mixed race person, just to be real. But for people who are like the most visibly Black, entering a synagogue, you're often assumed that you don't belong there. You can be profiled by the police. So this is like the kind of issues that I try to bring awareness to in my writing. When we're talking about Black Jewish relations, another really hot button topic tends to be how Israel and Palestine enters the US racial justice discourse. And Black Lives Matter has been a huge like flashpoint for that. What a lot of people don't know is that Alicia Garza, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, is a Black Jewish woman. Rachel Gilmer, who was a leader in the Dream Defenders movement in Florida, who also helped write the Movement for Black Lives platform that was very controversial because of its mentioning of Israel and Palestine, is also a Black Jewish woman. And so I think it's really important to remember that Black Jews are part of these movements. And so framing the Jewish community as being harmed or threatened by them also tends to ignore the fact that there are Jews who are leaders in these movements. And so for me, that's been a very important thing to cover in my work. And I also happen to have a background also in Palestinian rights organizing when I was in college. Now I do a lot of documentary work in Israel and Palestine. And one of the sort of tasks that I've taken on for myself is trying to show that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, that you can support Israelis and Palestinians and on a human rights basis. One of my documentaries, No Man's Land, deals with the Israeli Black Panther Party, which was organizing by Mizrahi Jews in Israel against, state racism they experienced. And while these are people who, like in the US, we probably wouldn't necessarily label as Black under our racial categories, like in Israel, they were labeled as Black. And so they took up that mantle of like being inspired by the Black Panther Party here. And so that's like one of the things that I cover. I also do like David mentioned, I did a documentary series with Ethiopian Israelis who were refusing their military service, not out of the sort of normal reason that you tend to hear, which is Palestine solidarity, but because they felt that the social contract in Israel, which is that if you serve in the military, you're supposed to receive the sort of rights of citizenship guaranteed to everyone, was being failed due to racism that they experienced. There's very high levels of incarceration for Ethiopian Israelis in the military, and a lot of different, like people have a hard time getting their status as Jews accepted by the Israeli government, even if they were born there. There's like a tremendous amount of barriers just full participation in society for Ethiopian Israelis. So that's something I covered alongside my continuing work with like Palestinian child prisoners, looking at like the situation for kids in Gaza who are living under siege. I really think part of my role is to be someone who tries to have solidarity for as many people as possible, because I know from my own life that that's kind of what I need. I can't, stand up for myself if I'm only standing up for like one side of myself or the other side of myself. I kind of have to show up as a whole person. And so for me, a lot of my work is trying to develop like really an intersectional and holistic analysis where we can say, actually, we don't have to stop at a border with our solidarity and our care for people. My current big project right now is about African asylum seekers in Israel. I actually just announced this week that I'm going to be a resident filmmaker at the Jewish Film Institute in San Francisco. I'm completing my documentary Half Freedom, which covers the social protest movements of African asylum seekers resisting deportation from Israel and also mass incarceration. And they were very influenced also by the Black Lives Matter movement here in the US. So there's a lot of resonances with that. And in the course of doing that film, I also found a similar thing where like, if you want to talk about the conditions of African asylum seekers, you have to also talk about the conditions of Mizrahi Jews, because a lot of times African asylum seekers are being dumped into their neighborhoods, and it's the only place they're really able to live. And so you can't really address one issue without addressing the other. And sorry. And also, one of the characters in my film happens to be a Palestinian woman who married an African asylum seeker. So you can see the sort of connections and relationships that they have through that. And my real goal with this film is to really make an argument for pluralism, that same place that I started, in my own life, because in order for any of these communities to be free, we have to have a society that is accepting of them. And that's not a lesson, that's just not just me like finger wagging towards Israel. It's really, I think, a lesson that we all need to be internalizing. And when we talk about Black-Jewish relations, and the sort of problematics of that, we have to like remember that these lines that we've drawn are not set in stone, and there's always going to be people in between them. So yeah, thanks so much. David, I think you're muted.
You are 100% right. I am muted. Sorry. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that. That was really, really fascinating, and so much to think about. Before we continue, I just want to mention that you can type your questions, if you have any, on the Q&A, and if I can answer them immediately, if there's sort of logistical kind of questions, I will try to do that. But otherwise, of course, we'll have the panelists deal with them at the end. So thank you for that. And then I guess without further ado, let's have Tema. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's really been a really meaningful, I will say, Black History Month for me this year. Just the number of opportunities I've had to speak to my Jewish community, broadly stated, in ways that I haven't before. And it's just been such a meaningful experience. And I'm just grateful for everyone who is coming. So a little bit about me. I am born and raised in Toronto. My mother is also born and raised in Toronto. My grandmother was born and raised in Toronto. My grandfather was the Montrealer. Very common in Canadian Jewish households that you have a Montreal Jew and a Toronto Jew. So that's my mother's side of the family. My father's side of the family were from the Bahamas. And a few years before my father was born, they moved from Nassau up to New York. And my father is Black, and he has a large Catholic family, and he was one of a few of his siblings. He's the second youngest who were born in the US. And he grew up on Staten Island, which, if you're familiar with New York City, is not exactly where you imagine a Black Caribbean family settling in the 50s. They were actually drawn there by the Catholic worker movement. They were very involved. And actually, my cousin has been pulling together this amazing trove from Dorothy Day's diaries and the Catholic worker newsletters that mention my family in various ways, which has been just so amazing to see. And my dad grew up on Staten Island, attended a Catholic prep school on the Upper West Side. He was the only Black kid, and very much grew up sort of really steeped in this really deep American anti-Black racism context. And it's actually been very interesting to start that I think some of my family has started to think about the difference in self-perception of the older siblings who had their childhood in the Bahamas and then moved in their teenage years and later, versus my father and his brothers at the younger end of the family who were born and raised exclusively in the United States. My parents met in a used bookstore in Greenwich Village where they both worked in the late 70s. My mom went to art school in New York, and for all sorts of reasons, some financial, some safety, they ended up moving back to Canada, to Toronto, where they got married in 1980. And I came along a couple of years later, and then my brother a couple of years after that. My family, I think it's so great that David mentioned like Toronto is the most diversity in the world. You feel that here. You really do feel that here. And I grew up in downtown Toronto in, it's called co-op housing. It's a British model where essentially each housing unit is a nonprofit co-op, and there are some subsidized units and there are some market rent units. And most of the organization of the structure itself and like the functioning of the community is done by the residents. So there's like a board, and one of the co-ops we lived in, we all had to take turns like doing the cleaning and like all of that sort of stuff. So that's the context that I grew up in. I did not grow up in the Jewish community really at all, beyond my grandparents taking my brother and I every Saturday to the Jewish neighborhood, which is also not where they lived, but taking us out for lunch or dinner every Saturday. For us, we were, my parents had the conversation before we were born that we were going to be a Jewish family in the way that was meaningful to my parents, which was, I have a Yiddish name. I'm named after a family member. My brother has a Hebrew name. We were always sort of taught that we were Black and Jewish from very young age. And we did, every year we would spend one night of the holidays with my grandparents for sort of a very, I don't know, like when you imagine like the sitcom of the boring Seder, like with all the generations, that. And then one night in what I would now call a very eclectic setting of our family friends, many of whom were artists and nonprofit workers and social workers and people who worked in equity. And we used one of the Seder supplements from the Shalom Seders, Arthur Wasko's sort of supplements, where Moses is a union organizer. So that kind of paints a picture of like my Jewish childhood. My parents were active on the left, and eventually, when I was very young, my father worked in a community center in Regent Park, which is a housing projects neighborhood. My mother was active volunteering there as well, and was still working in the antiquarian book trade. Eventually, my father left that job and ended up working in a department that was called Multiculturalism and Race Relations, and then eventually became Access and Equity. And I believe it's called something to do with anti-racism now. I keep meaning to look up what the evolution of that department was. My mother sat on the board of a settlement house that was a community center in our neighborhood, but was a settlement sort of center. And eventually went back to school to become a journalist, and then a social worker, and eventually a therapist. So for me, my identities were always so woven together with also these conversations that were just dinner table conversation in our house, like social justice, racial equity. Some of the jokes when I think back to my childhood was like, you knew my dad was late, was going to be home late when he would write on the calendar like what nights he was out for work. And you knew it was late if he was at city council or if it was Caravana meetings, which are the big Toronto Caribbean Carnival. So like this is very much the environment that I grew up in. Also, there's ways that Toronto is significantly different due to its diversity to a lot of American cities. For example, I had my first Black teacher in kindergarten, in grade 1, my second in grade 2. I had more later. Black history was done in school. My mom actually really lobbied hard to have it brought into the entirety of the school board. And we had all sorts of those cultural elements. My mother was also very involved in making sure we were learning about Judaism in school, sort of in a show and tell model of like, I went to public school. So it's like, here's the holidays, and my mom would come and teach the kids about Rosh Hashanah, kind of a thing. And so this was very integrated in my life. I'm going to fast forward a bunch of years. So I, was always very curious about Jewish community, which was a place that we weren't. And we weren't in Jewish community for a number of reasons, but a big one was that we were an interfaith, interracial family in a Jewish community that to this day is quite small c conservative. Our community here is, I don't want to say insular, it's not insular, but it is. For example, the recent survey that was done here showed that the rate of intermarriage in our Jewish community is about half that of the United States. So looking at things like that, you can imagine in the 80s, this interfaith, interracial family would stick out like a sore thumb. And we did. Some of the stories that I'm told, and I'm grateful I don't remember, or things like my grandfather walking us out of a very famous Toronto dairy restaurant, United Bakers, if you know Toronto, and overhearing a woman from one of the tables musing out loud, adopted. So very clearly, like, we did not fit. Fast forward to university, I studied philosophy. And what I was finding was that all of the philosophers I was having these questions of, these sort of ethical, moral questions about how this kind of fits, and really sort of clicking with, are all Jews. Every single one of them is Jewish. And I'm like, okay, like there's something here. I've been asking these questions since I was a little kid about what does Judaism mean? And like, yes, we're Jewish, but like, why aren't we more Jewish? Why aren't we going to synagogue? Why aren't we doing all of this? Anyhow, I end up going into religious studies for grad school, where I am explicitly studying modern Jewish thought. During that time, I went to Israel for a year to Hebrew University, where I was studying with a number of the people in my classes during that year were people in their first year of rabbinical school or in Jewish educator programs from the US. And all of a sudden, there was like this world that just opened up of this very sort of liberal Jewish world that I had not been exposed to previously, but also people who were like not weirded out that I was mixed, and people who were like, yeah, like that's totally a valid Jewish identity. In fact, let me tell you about these other mixed Jewish people. I moved back to Toronto, tried to find more people like me, and like came up blank. Long story short, I started really becoming obsessed with the idea of building community for people who might have been like me to find it. Because that's all I wanted, was to find, first of all, families that look like mine, but also to be able to meaningfully engage in Jewish life. Next week will be my 12th anniversary of being a Jewish professional, which continues to boggle my mind. But I went into working in synagogues quite early, and really was interested in what does it look like to open community to interfaith families who are looking to do Jewish. What does it mean to create a space where a Black Jew can walk in and not have their identity whether questioned or commented on even, and what does it mean to create those spaces? That kind of carried me through the next number of years. About a little over a year ago, not long before the pandemic started, I was really fortunate to actually find a job doing, I'm an educator by nature and by training, and I just still my entire Jewish professional life really just wanted to actively work with other Jewish organizations to help them create those spaces that people can walk into. And as luck, fate, whatever would have it, a job dropped into my lap. And when I say that, I mean, I was sitting in an adult ed, like a adult training and development class, and they always give you, like, at the end of each class, they give you a little talk on how to find a job in the field. And as I'm sitting there, my phone pings that somebody sent me my current role, which is Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors. We used to be called Interfaith Family. And what that person does, now me, is I work with Jewish organizations to help them address all these issues of inclusion for interfaith families. When we're talking about interfaith families, of course, we're talking about many interracial families. We are, and I just think of like this moment after George Floyd's murder last year, where normally I would have been the only person within our organization with any sort of connection to lived experience with that. In our organization, there were 4 of us, which was just so mind-boggling to me to sort of really see that overlap. And of course, that's not all Black Jews. That just happens to be the way I'm a Black Jew. So for me, that was very meaningful. I've been really lucky over the last year as well to be able to, as on the side of my role, spend time in Jewish organizations talking about the imperative of not just doing anti-racism work sort of outward facing because it's a justice issue, which I think is something that Jewish communities are happy to sort of fall there, whether, we can have conversations about do they do it well, do they not, but actually what I'm more interested in the fact that yes, it's important to show up for racial justice. I think that's a moral imperative, but also to show up for Black Jews within our communities. And I think we've very frequently been able to do the outward facing stuff because it's easier than looking inwards at the ways in which we've failed Black Jews inside our community. So I always say, yes, Black Jewish relations is a thing. There is a Black community and a Jewish community that do not overlap, but it is imperative. And I always talk from where I sit, which is within the Jewish world. That's where I do my work. It is imperative within the Jewish world to not forget that group that overlaps, and that I'm grateful, like more and more conversations are happening about it. It's been a very busy year for me, which has been like just wonderful to be able to think about this very deeply and strategically. At the same time, I think there's just so much work to be done. I try and bring some of these issues up when I write. I haven't filed a story since June, so I don't know whether I can actually call myself a writer right now, but that's another topic. But most of my writing has been focused on questions of encouraging the Jewish community to understand, whether it's understanding the Black community, in quotes, or whether it's encouraging the Jewish community to understand the experiences of racism that Black Jews and other Jews of color, but I speak about Black Jews because that's my experience, have. I've been able to talk, I talk a lot about passing because as questions of are Jews white come up, a lot of the time language pops up like, well, we pass for white, but recognizing that passing has a very specific meaning in the American context, which is somebody who had to abandon all trace of their Black identity in order to have legal access to things. And for me, that's something that is like a trauma. I carry that sort of knowledge with me because of the way that I look, and sort of really encouraging the Jewish community to be aware, also not to say like, don't fight anti-Semitism, but to understand the linkages between the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Black racism, and also to be able to parse the differences between the experience of anti-Black racism and the experience of anti-Semitism. I feel so lucky to get to do this. It's really hard. It opens me, I'm going to be honest, to a litany of harassment. Rebecca and I know each other from Twitter and have both had to be there for each other through just rounds and rounds and rounds of vicious harassment. But at the same time, one of the things that keeps me going is looking at the people 10 years behind me and the growing diversity of our Jewish community and the growing diversity of our Jewish leadership. And that keeps me going because whatever small role I can play in paving the way so that they don't have to deal with that feels like a meaningful purpose to the work that I do. thank you again for having me. I look forward to answering your questions, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Tema. That was really great, and also again a lot to think about. And thank you so much for sharing all those experiences. So now we'll have our final speaker, Sherrina Gibson, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A after that. So please go ahead, Sherrina.
Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here with everyone today. So grateful to follow these two amazing speakers. And I am happy to have the privilege of representing the hometown, I guess, today in today's talk. I also want to start in that place of talking about the hometown, because although I am not a native Richmonder, this is my home. Temple Beth El is my home, and my story of Jewish faith and racism and how I sort of work between the two worlds and how they overlap for me is a lot different than our first two wonderful speakers, because I did not grow up with either parents being Jewish. I'm a proud Jew by choice. And although I often, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, often find it very affronting when that is assumed. But if I offer that, it's fine, and that's my space to do it. And again, I'm very proud of that. So my initial connection to Judaism is connected in family in a way because of a family who lived near us, where I grew up in Central California, in a very rural part of California, the San Joaquin Valley, which people do not think of when they think about California. It is not as diverse as what people think about when they think about San Francisco or when they think about LA. It is diverse in terms of political thinking. It is big C conservative in that area, very small town. And so being one of the few Black people in the town, it was natural, I guess, that the Jewish family and the Jewish boy my age, we just ended up being allies. And I fell in love with his family, and I fell in love with their faith. I fell in love with the way they practiced Judaism, and that grew from there. So that's how I was introduced to the faith. And as I continued on, went on to college at a historically Black university and studied sociology undergrad, I really became more immersed in understanding racial inequalities, social inequalities. And as most folks in that time in your life, you're struggling to piece together what your identity is. And I had that love for those practices. I had that love for Judaism as a religion. And whenever I had an opportunity to write a paper or to study more, it always involved something related to Judaism, whether that be the civil rights movement, Black-Jewish relations, hate crimes. And so my heart was always there even before I formally joined the people. I will also say my now husband, while we were in grad school, him being working on his doctorate at the time, we were talking about having a family and what that means. My husband is not Jewish. And when we were making the decision on how to raise a family, we agreed that Judaism, its tenets, were exactly how we wanted to raise our family. And that's one thing that kind of pushed me over the edge to formally convert. I have lived my life, my Jewish life here in Richmond. I have a 7-year-old daughter. And from the moment that I knew that I needed to put her in preschool, I knew that the only way to go was to put her in a Jewish preschool. And I will say it was met with some resistance for many reasons. As soon as I walked in the door, even though I had a wonderful conversation with the person on the phone, We were enrolled. The second I walked in the door was just everything stopped. Questioned, why are you Jewish? Which I'm sure no one else was asked that question when they walked in the door. Why are you here? What's your story? We're freely sharing our stories here today, but to have your sort of Jewish resume have to be handed out to you the second you walk in the door, I'm already a nervous mother about to put my 2-year-old out of my care for the first time. And being confronted with that, as you can imagine, was very disconcerting. My daughter went on to have a wonderful experience at that preschool, and we're still connected with that community. Even before we went on to Temple, which is the synagogue that I'm with right now. I wanted to join this conversation today because, unlike the other two panelists who spoke today, this is not what I do in my professional context. In my professional context, I am a health data nerd. I work with statistics, but I focus on inequalities and unearthing inequalities and making sure that voices are heard, not only through statistics, but also through stories. And because that is a key part of what I do for a living, it was a natural fit when the discussion of Black anti-racism and Judaism started happening in the last couple of years in this community. It felt like a natural fit for me to be a part of. Also, because of my work in the inclusion community in general. And by inclusion community in general, I am defining it in this talk as disability inclusion as well as racial inclusion as well. So in my work, I had the opportunity to start with another bunch of really talented women in developing a special initiative out of Temple called Project Elul, where we had conversations, meditation, learning, music, thought about how Black Jews fit into the discussion. A few things that I really wanted to bring out from my own experience and from experiences of others like me is, one, the experience of having to have that Jewish resume presented wherever you're in Jewish spaces. And two, to talk about the experience of anti-Semitism from the Black community, which is something that I get a lot of because I have family who are not at all Jewish. The questions that you receive, the expectation that you are Baptist, especially now that I'm living in the South, is quite disarming. And when I tell them I'm Jewish, you can imagine the shock, the confusion, and often very hurtful comments that we experience. I find that we don't often put that part into play. And as a Black Jew, I am often having a two-sided conversation where on the one hand, I feel that I am fighting against racism from my Jewish family, my Jewish community, when I'm asked why I'm here, who, good for you, who am I married to? My husband must be Jewish. He's not, because they don't meet him, they haven't seen him, they don't know if he's Black or not. And then on the other side with my African-American community, how can you be Jewish when you see what's happening in Israel, when you see what's happening amongst Palestinians? And it's really difficult to navigate between those two worlds, because I can have my political opinions about Israel in a geopolitical context, but I am a woman, a Black woman, and I certainly understand what it feels like to be a brown person in an oppressive situation. And by that context, there is no way that I can completely divorce myself of the Palestinian perspective in the conflict. I find that a very difficult and fraught conversation to have with my white Jewish counterparts, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. I've had many very challenging conversations where my white Jewish counterparts have tried to inform me of what Black Lives Matter means, which I see nods in the crowd on that. Do you know that Black Lives Matter means BDS and it's anti-Israel? I don't think that it should be explained to me what Black Lives Matter means. And sometimes I take the approach of educating and providing links. And then sometimes, as it's my right, I say the approach of maybe it means Black Lives Matter, period. And those are conversations that we could be here all day navigating and talking about. I think it's really important to discuss what are called microaggressions, although I really hate that term, microaggressions, because any Black person on here and many of the Jewish people on here can probably tell you every incident that's happened to them from when they were a child till now. So it's really not that micro when it affects you at that level. Those microaggressions, just to give a definition or to give an example, is as simple as going to the grocery store. Richmond is a small town. Richmonders wouldn't like me saying that, but it's a small town. And the Jewish community here is relatively small as well. And so you can imagine someone like me in the South going into a grocery store, going to the kosher section, and almost every other time I go in there, someone asks me, am I lost? What do you need? Can I help you? And not people that work there, which I find quite interesting, to say the least. If there's one thing I want out of this conversation today, and I would like people to think about, is, you know, what does a Jewish person look like, and where does that idea come from? And really think about unpacking that and where you understood that. There are no white people in the Bible. And I really want people to just kind of sit with that for a moment. Where do those stories take place? Another point that I'd like to make and to bring up for discussion is also when Jews are involved in civil rights or anti-racism work, is to really give space to the African Americans or other people of color when they're talking about their racist experience, without co-opting that with experiences of anti-Semitism. Certainly, anti-Semitism deserves its own due in terms of inequalities and being excluded, but there are differences. I can't tell you how many times I hear, I understand Black Lives Matter, I understand racism. My family came here as immigrants. For me, as an African American, where my great-great-grandmother was a slave, it is not a story of immigration. It's a story of being a hostage. That's very different, and it should be given its own due. For me, this work is really important for Black Jews, for the wider Jewish community, and of course, personally, for my Black 7-year-old Jewish daughter, who is trying to navigate this world as one of the only, if not the only, in her spaces, in her Black Jewish spaces, in her Black spaces. And she's trying to navigate that no one looks like her or no one practices her faith in the same ways that she does. And so I want to see my loving daughter and folks like her and other kids like her in a space where Black Jewish, where we're not a unicorn or fetishized, where we belong, we're not just included in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherrina. That was really great. Great to hear about those local experiences, even when obviously some of them were quite upsetting. This has been an amazing event thus far. I've really learned so much. I hope all of you have as well. I'm going to ask a question or two, and then we will go to the Q&A section. We already have some good questions in there. Please feel free to keep asking the questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So my question that I sort of been touched upon in what the speakers have said is simply how, as Jews of color, as Black Jews, do you see your relationship to the Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi divide, right? Do you fit in a certain way or not? And what does that mean to you? And of course, I'll just preface that by saying, and I know we might get some of this from the speakers, that there's this view, of course, that Black Jews cannot be Ashkenazi, which is of course false, right? So that's another issue, but I'd love to hear from our speakers, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I can kick that one off. I am extremely Ashkenazi. Like my mother is Ashkenazi. I was raised with my Ashkenazi grandparents. My name is Yiddish, you know, and all of our food growing up, my mother did a lot of the cooking. You know, I went to dairy restaurants with my grandparents in like Toronto's Jewish neighborhood. You know, had lox and cream cheese on a bagel every weekend. My Jewish identity is deeply Ashkenazi. And at the same time, though, I think what my Blackness, I think my, you know, Blackness does something to that, because I am not half one and half the other. I'm entirely both. And so for me, like, yes, it's my minhag, you know, like my tradition. I go to a Reform temple. I mean, Reform is Ashkenazi. It's like extremely that way. But at the same time, because I'm mixed, I do also at the same time feel outside of it a lot. So I feel it is me and it's not always. And sort of, it's been really interesting working in the community as the conversations around like diverse Judaism also mean conversations around Ashkenazi Jews are the majority in North America. How do we make sure that other historic Jewish stories and communities and practices and experiences are part of that? It's been interesting to sort of reflect on my, you know, as they call it, Ashkenormativity, on my own Ashkenormativity, because that is the Jews that I grew up around. That's my family, that's our community. And at the same time, understand that feeling of seeing this like Jewish thing that you don't quite totally click with. You know, some of the things that have been really funny as I've been reflecting more is like, my mother has been watching like all sorts of, we're allowed one person in our bubbles here. And so my mother is my bubble. So she comes over every weekend and she's just been watching like Jewish shows on Amazon Prime or Netflix or whatever. And a bunch of them are in Yiddish. And I was shocked to realize I understood a lot of it when I was sitting in a different room. And like, those are the moments where I'm just like, wow, I was really deeply steeped in like, even though my grandparents were born here, in a very sort of deeply sort of immigrant / refugee Ashkenazi Jewish culture. And at the same time, always feeling a little bit of distance from it, both because of the judgment, and the judgment I will say is also, it's about being an interfaith family, is about being an interracial family. You know, one of the jokes in my family, just to sort of frame this, was when my grandmother told her sister that my mother was marrying my father. My grandmother said, and excuse the language, what do I care what color he is? A goy is a goy. You know, the joke in the family, of course, like later on is like, yeah, and if he had been a Black Jew, she would have had a problem with that too. But, you know, this was, that was the hierarchy of issues, was like not Jewish, then race. So, you know, feeling kind of also outside of it for that reason. So it's But at the same time, like I walk into Jewish spaces and everyone just clocks me as an Ashkenazi Jew. I actually look like my dad's side of the family, but I have white skin. But I walk into Jewish spaces, I've got curly brown hair, white skin, glasses. So, you know, it feels very sort of natural, but at the same time, always feeling that little bit of distance.
And I can also speak to this issue. I think like I'm also an Ashkenazi Jew, but because I'm like, you know, a little more racially ambiguous, people tend to assume I'm Sephardi or Mizrahi a lot of the time. And when I'm in Israel, I'm treated as Mizrahi till people find out I'm Black, and all of a sudden, like, we have a problem. Like, but I think that this sort of, but there are many, I know a lot of Black Sephardi Jews and a lot of people who have been practicing Judaism in their families for a very long time who are practicing in a Sephardi tradition. Some of that comes from slavery, some of that, you know, existed in resistance to it. I mean, it all is in resistance to it, but, you know, like just coming through these different histories. And I think it's really important to note that, like, in the same way that we're in between the Black community and the Jewish community, we're often in between a lot of different spaces within the Jewish community. And I think that there is an extent to which also, when people primarily think of the Jewish community as being divided between Ashkenazi and Sephardi, you forget that there are ancient Black Jewish traditions, like the Ethiopian tradition, that predates Rabbinic Judaism. And so a lot of times when people sort of just divide between these two minhag, they forget that there's more than that, and there's always been more than that. And so, and that's another reason that, like, including Black Jewish conversations and having more than just like one version of that represented is so important, because people, you know, it's a false dichotomy that it's just Mizrahi or just Sephardi Ashkenazi kind of a dynamic. And there's also a further issue, which is that, like, Mizrahi is like a term coming from like Israeli like racial classifications and tradition, like, communities. And so we also have to be careful about how we try to transpose that onto the US in the same way we don't want to transpose American racial hierarchies or ways of talking about race onto Israel, because people just have cultural specific ways of dealing with this stuff.
Sherrina.
I'll add briefly. Again, I have great fortune of being able to start my own traditions in my family. When we interact with members of our community, especially here in Richmond, it is almost exclusively in an Ashkenazi normative fashion. But here in my household and in what me and my daughter do, I have studied a lot about the Igbos, and I really found a strong connection with that. For example, every Shabbat, every Friday, I wrap my hair in some sort of kente cloth or African fabric. And for me, that helps me connect in a tradition that to me feels very rooted in African culture, as well as my Judaism.
Thank you. That's great. All right, so I think I'm going to turn to the questions that people have asked, and because this is a VCU event, I want to start and give some privilege to one of my students who is in attendance, who has asked a question. So Zoe has asked, what are some of the conflicts or problems between the Jewish community and the Black community? You guys mentioned how Jewish people were trying to explain the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was wondering if you could talk about the division in a bit more detail from both sides. Does it depend on the location you live in, and what are some general things you guys have noticed?
So I can like head this off. I think when we talk about the conflicts between the communities, there's a lot of high profile incidents of, you know, when a Black person says something anti-Semitic, that it becomes this like media story that goes on for a really long time. I'm thinking right now about Nick Cannon's comments this summer, which I was lucky enough to get to be in an all Black panel discussing this for a Black audience. And that was a really generative thing. And his comments were about who are the true Jews. And that is rooted in you know, a Christian hegemonic idea, really, like in some cases, theology. There's a belief that when Jewish people didn't accept Christ as the Messiah, they gave up the covenant, and thus became the false Jews, and Christians became the real chosen people. And this is something that Black folks, through colonialism internalized through the way that, when Christianity was sort of being pushed on people. And that's not to say it's just colonial to practice Christianity. The Black church is like a liberation movement in many ways, but it does still hold some ideas about Jewish people that can be quite, like rooted in what was originally white Christian hegemony. That is a different issue for me personally than when Black Lives Matter expresses solidarity with Palestinians, which a lot of people in the Jewish community sort of get triggered by and will react to it as if it's the same thing. There can be anti-Semitism on the left. I've experienced it, like including in Black spaces, but I want to be really clear that when Black folks are organizing in solidarity with Palestinians, which is often presented as this conflict with Jewish people, it comes from decades of relationships. And a lot of that goes back to, the Black Power and Third World liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. When you're talking about people like George Jackson, there was a poem that was found. He's a Black Panther who was incarcerated. And when he was killed in prison by prison guards, there was a poem found in his cell that many people attributed to him that was later revealed to be by a Palestinian prisoner poet who was describing his experience. So there's a lot of, like, in the same way that Black and Jewish people have shared struggle and shared history, Black and Palestinian people have shared struggle and shared history. And a lot of the conflict between our communities is around how that gets negotiated, unfortunately. And, I think Sherrina spoke really eloquently about how anti-Semitism does affect us in our communities. I'm often hesitant. I want to talk about that in front of Black audiences usually, and I'm not going to assume who's in the room right now. But I'm often hesitant because it does get instrumentalized. And when you see there's this concept of Black anti-Semitism as somehow being worse than white anti-Semitism. And in my experience, I've experienced all types of Christian hegemony from all types of people, and it's very similar. I don't think Black people are actually that unique in it. But what is unique is the way that our communities under white supremacy get pitted against each other that we have to be really aware of. And there are ways in which Jewish people, in sort of assimilating in the US and being able to move up that ladder, were able to benefit from things that were at the expense of Black folks that also can kind of make those like little Christian hegemonic ideas seem like more real to people. This idea of Jews in power becomes realer to them, even though that's still a misconception, because of these like structural issues. And so it's very, we could probably do a whole event about how these things happen, but there's a lot of ways that that comes into play. And then on the other side of that, there is like anti-Black racism in the Jewish community, which I think we've all discussed, but like, that is just part of, making yourself feel superior in the United States, is comparing yourself to Black people and Black people being the negative. And unfortunately, that's something that like many of our co-religionists have done without even realizing it.
I just want to add on, and I think, my context for this is really New York, which is where my parents met. It's where my dad's family lives, and it's where I spend time. And it's also been a city that has been a flashpoint in this idea of conflict between the Black community and the Jewish community at numerous times. But most recently, I think of like last winter before the pandemic, and that time where people were like out doing things, where there were a number of random attacks on Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. And, so there's these histories of these entrenched conflicts. I'm going to just like mention a couple of really amazing things to read. One is, if you can find the video of it, even better, but the play Fires in the Mirror about the Crown Heights riots is just phenomenal. Anna Devere Smith one-woman play where she actually takes on these characters of Black people from the neighborhood and Jews from the neighborhood, and then other like leaders. Phenomenal. James Baldwin has a piece that you can find quite easily on the internet from the civil rights era about why it sort of talks to a lot of the things that Rebecca just mentioned around the way that Christian hegemony has pitted Black people and Jews against each other. So for example, within sort of Christian tradition, Jews became middlemen, and in many ways that was kind of preserved in New York specifically, which is my context, by the roles that Jews who were able to move out of the neighborhoods that they had shared with Black folk continued to play in those neighborhoods. He calls out the social worker, the teacher, the landlord, the person who owns the overpriced grocery store, et cetera, et cetera. So, this is not Jews profiting off of Black folk, it's society putting Jews into positions. And he really spends a lot of time unpacking that. I think what Rebecca said is really something I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is it is a lot easier for me to talk about anti-Semitism that comes from the Black community with Black people than it is in the Jewish community, because of the way that it has been weaponized so many times against Jews showing up for Black people. I do a lot of talks around the need for sort of anti-racism, sort of work within the Jewish community, and very often the two things that I hear back from the Jewish communities I'm in are, well, the Jews marched with, or Heschel marched with Martin Luther King in the 60s. Like, if that's your only example, like, that needs work. But also, like, and then the Black community abandoned us and turned into anti-Semites. Why should we do anything for them? Which, first of all, if it's a tit for tat, it's not really liberation movements. Like, that's very clear to me, number one. Number two, I happen to believe that being in dialogue with people to repair relationships is better than like throwing up your hands and walking away from tables. That's very much how I sort of view this. But also like that sort of, also this sort of patronizing attitude of like, after all we did for the Black community, you know, the Jews founded the NAACP and fought for civil rights, and, you know, we're involved in trying to get Black people registered to vote, and then the Black people turned on us, is a discourse that plays itself out over and over and over and over again in the Jewish community, to the point that I give talks on why that's wrong. And I think, you know, it makes me sort of anxious to talk about. And I've heard anti-Semitism coming from the Black community, like, of course, the same way I've heard anti-Black racism coming from the Jewish community. And I think, you know, this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I think is really important to sort of try to parse. But there's phenomenal books out there and phenomenal essays on it. Highly recommend it. And also, if you go to my website, not to like plug myself, but like I gave a talk on it that has like the books that I would recommend in the first 2 minutes. I just don't remember them all off the top of my head.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So I actually wanted to just go to another question, which is directly for Sherrina. And it's a question coming from Christopher Brooks, who's an anthropology professor here at VCU. And he asks, I would like for Ms. Gibson to elaborate on her having to display her Jewish credentials in formal Jewish settings.
Yes, thank you for the question. The presenting your Jewish resume, that typically follows after you have walked into a Jewish space, whether that be at a synagogue or whether you're at an event in someone's home, and you get the quizzical look. I do, and then the questions. Why I mean, some people are so bold as to what brought you here? Good for you for coming. Or are you Jewish? Where was your bat mitzvah? Where were your parents from? Or questioning you, or like, here, I know you didn't know, but this is the book that we're going to be using today to follow along in the services. It is just very, and I'm sure it's very, to me, analogous to what I experience in the professional world as well. When I walk in the room looking the way I look, and there's a presentation up there with some wonderfully done statistical, beautiful models, and no one looks at me, they look at my white male colleague. That couldn't possibly be you. And then when they find out it is me, what made you go into this field? I get that same question. What made you decide to be Jewish? And it may seem to some like that is, you know, that seems like a good question. I mean, they're curious of why you're Jewish, but what you're asking about is something that is a part of my soul, that is my faith. It's not what car did I pick. That is not something that somebody who meets me within 2 minutes should feel comfortable asking. You are literally asking me to bare my soul. It is an integral part of who I am, who I continue to be, how I live, how I breathe every morning. And that question should be asked with a lot of restraint and with a lot of respect. And so when I say, explain what is my Jewish resume, it is, if you're Jewish, which I don't believe you are, I wouldn't have even asked you this question, how and is it legit and why?
Oh, no, I'm muted. Thank you so much for that. All right, so we're going to try to get in a few more questions before we close. So I want to start with Elliot Ratzman, who is actually an expert on these sort of topics himself. He says, "Amazing voices. Thanks, comrades. How can Jewish synagogues, groups, and institutions combat white supremacy, especially deep-seated structural racism in the North American context?"
I'll start on that briefly. I would say the first thing is to name it plainly, not to use terms like let's be diverse, let's be included. Candidly, succinctly, and clearly name anti-racism and call it out for exactly what it is. It's not calling someone a derogatory term. It is the structural, systemic racism. It's the interpersonal racism and how those two things are mutually reinforcing. It's important to put those terms out there. It's important to clarify those terms. It's important to share personal experiences and to listen to those experiences without qualification from white voices, without giving undue or any space, quite frankly, to spaces. I would say that's the way to start, and that's what has worked well, in particular in our temple at Temple Beth Al. We named it. We said what we're going to talk about. We're going to give spaces and deference to those who have lived experiences, and we are not going to temper the conversation because of for the comfort of the white folks in the room.
If you're looking at systematic change in an institutional sense, there's a really great initiative that popped up this year called Not Free to Desist, which was created by Black Jews and Jews of color with very clear guidelines that organizations can undertake. They're sort of, they're framed as being like obligations that you can choose to perform for like people of color in your community, that it affects everything from leadership to how, funding decisions are made, to programming, to making the space more inclusive. And it has a really clear step-by-step guide. And whether you're following that to the letter or using it like, more in its principles, I think that that's really great. There's one specific thing that I've thought of recently that I really want to start asking our Jewish communal institutions to do is spend half the time, or actually really more time, if we're being honest, that you spend addressing Black Jewish controversy, sticking up for Jews of color. Tema referenced this, but there's been a horrible harassment campaign lately towards Jews of color, towards converts. Young people, like teenagers, are getting bullied online, and our Jewish communal institutions are totally silent. I haven't even seen like an article about this, and it's constant. It happened to me this in December. I was targeted. There's a website that calls itself like Stop Anti-Semitism, that's supposed to be fighting anti-Semitism, that targeted me for being patrilineal. And when I pushed back against that, like, they were tweeting about how I talk about bad things about Israel or talk about racism in the Jewish community because I'm a patrilineal Jew and people don't accept me. And I'm a reformed, so like I'm perfectly accepted in my community. That's not like actually something I have a big chip on my shoulder about, to be honest with you. But the response to me calling that out as racist was that they declared me anti-Semite of the week. And they linked to my Twitter account and said, report her. And I was actually briefly kicked off Twitter because of this. And that may sound like, oh, this is happening on the internet, it's not a real thing, but like this is Twitter is a main space for Black Jews to come together, actually. And in the weeks that followed, they did this, similar things to other Black Jewish people, some who are much younger and more vulnerable than me. And there's just like thousands of accounts on there right now that are harassing people. And I'm like, why is the like head of the URJ tweeting about Michael Che's SNL joke about Israel? And he hasn't said anything about what's happening to like Black Jews right now. So I think that like part of it is naming racism in our community and naming that there are like, this organization that was targeting me, it's a verified account on Twitter. It's like funded by some Jewish funders, and like that are also funding, like working with Hadassah and other mainstream Jewish orgs. And why are we making space for like really horrible racist abuse in our community and not speaking out on it? So that's like one thing I would say. If you see that stuff happening and you're in any kind of position that's in a space to speak out, that needs to be responded to, because I'm really worried about this younger generation who, like, I didn't have to grow up with that same level of scrutiny that they did. That happened to me later. They're like 18, 16, dealing with this. How are they supposed to like grow up and feel safe in this community?
And like by adults bullying them under their own names with their city, like people have to know these people. So yes, I want to say yes to both of the things that have already been said and add one more piece. And this is just sort of a piece that I think about a lot. So where I live in Toronto, where my congregation is in Toronto, is like one neighborhood over from the historic Jamaican community in Toronto. And that community is being completely destroyed by there's been like transit construction and also gentrification and there's tons of campaign really being generated from within this historic community to save this community. I gave a talk not long after George Floyd's murder, just like one of those like kiddish chats on Zoom. And I said something about this neighborhood, and like you could see in the Zoom room that people did not know this neighborhood existed. When I say it's like the next neighborhood over, I mean, the way Toronto is, you cross like the subway tracks and then you go one more block and that's where the neighborhood starts. It is literally the next neighborhood over, but because there's like a little sort of expressway there, most of the people who are leaving the sort of more heavily Jewish neighborhood don't keep driving that way. And so it's very easy to just not know it exists. And so one of the challenges I've issued to my own community is, first of all, figure out like where the Black community is, where the Black businesses are, like pay attention to how segregated your life is. Number one. And number two, the congregation I used to work at, I'm now a member, and in a hilarious twist of fate, I chair the DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, and my mother chairs the Anti-Racism Committee. So I've got a voice on the inside there as well, which has been really fun. We have great conversations. But, thinking about like, what does it mean to do anti-racism work out of a synagogue? Well, there happens to be a lot of institutional privilege in this congregation. It doesn't take a lot to get the mayor to come for a visit, especially at campaign time. What would it look like if the synagogue with this institutional privilege took the call to action that Black Urbanism Toronto has issued about saving this neighborhood and brought it using that sort of status that they have with city councilors, with the mayor, brought it to the attention there? And so, this is sort of, I think, additive, and I think it also has to be navigated carefully because, again, some of those trends around like, it can get a little bit patronizing if it's not done carefully, but sort of that taking the call and saying like, actually, this is a connection that I have that I can use to introduce the decision makers to you by making it very clear to those decision makers that this is important to me and that I'm a donor to their campaign. And being able to sort of do that sort of work. And I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot is like the Jewish community does organize in these sort of big picture ways, right? Like it's all very sort of top down, institution led, whereas a lot of Black organizing is very grassroots and smaller organizations. So what would it look like to sort of recognize those grassroots organizations as like vital community groups at the same level as like a Jewish advocacy org, and listen to them the same way that you would sort of an organization that you recognize. So finding those and building those relationships. I think it's a really easy thing to strive for. It's hard to do because relationship building is very hard work. This isn't going to fix everything like in a second. But at the same time, I think, just being aware of who's out there in your community. Find the Black Jews in your community. They'll tell you who's out there because we know. And we're also very often happy to be the go-betweens to make those introductions, because these are things that are important to us. And so I think, there's so many layers of doing it on top of that deep internal work that both Sherrina and Rebecca talked about.
All right, thank you. And so going to try to get maybe a couple more questions in. First, I want to ask a question or relay a question from a fellow Canadian, Mira Sukharov, who writes, Mira is also a professor of Jewish studies. Many non-POC Jews reject the label of whiteness. I'm not white, they say. I'm Jewish. Is it important, do you think, in anti-racism awareness and activism to press the point that white Jews are indeed white in terms of the structures of white privilege as they currently exist? Or is it more of an academic debate that distracts from the actual work?
Can I kick this one off? Because I literally gave a talk on this last night. Both and hi, Mira. Both and, I think there's, it's super important. And one of the things that I always insist on when having conversations about anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism is understanding positionality, is understanding social location, is understanding what privilege means and looks like. And I think one of the unique things that I'm able to do in that situation, because of the way that I look, is make it easier for people to maybe think a little bit more expansively about it, because I can be like, sure, I am Black, like my father is Black, I look like him. When I'm in, Caribbean neighborhoods, I'm clocked immediately. But at the same time, I have all this white privilege. And if I can say that, then certainly you can. And I spent some time last night on it. And I think this is something that needs to happen internally in the Jewish community, because I think what has happened is that the people and in the white Jewish community, the people who are in the position to sort of push the conversation are the people who are not white by any definition, and I think so what's happened is, while there is the academic conversation going on that I think is a vital conversation that I take a lot of resources from, I think what has often happened is because Jews have experienced racialized anti-Semitism and experience ways in which Jews really do legitimately feel distanced from whiteness because of the way anti-Semitism functions, to create spaces for Jews to unpack that together so that the whiteness conversation becomes a little bit less fraught. And I've tried to create spaces like that with some success, and I hope to be able to continue to create those spaces. But I think it is a really important conversation. And I think one of the things that ends up happening is it ends up derailing the anti-racism work, which is why I say both and, because on the one hand, there is a moment where you can say, okay, let's not let this derail the work. Does it really matter how you define yourself? At the same time, I find that usually I'm not white is used either to minimize anti-Black racism by sort of conflating it with anti-Semitism in those moments, or to say that Jews can't possibly be racist because they're not white. And so it's less about the definition for me and more about the way the definition is deployed. I actually say Jews are white with an asterisk, and the asterisk is thousands of years of persecution. It is a big asterisk, and that's very true. But I think it is something that is a real challenge that we need to push our community to grapple with.
And just, I think Tema really broke it down in a great way. On a personal level, I don't actually care how an individual person identifies. It's not my business. But how it gets deployed is. And when, you know, I've heard people make this argument, I've heard them say things like Jews of color don't exist because all Jews are Jews of color. That is so hurtful and offensive. And further, it's dishonest. You know, a big part of why I used to argue with people about this a lot on the internet. I don't anymore. I've retired from that conversation. But like growing up, you know, the exclusion that I felt in the Jewish community sometimes was on the basis of me not being white. It was, you know, going to like there's like a Jewish country club in Highland Park, Illinois, where the Jewish part of my family is from, that exists because Jews were excluded from white Christian country clubs, the same country clubs that wouldn't allow Black people to be members. And Jewish people had to form their own institution in a similar way to how Black people had to form our own institutions. But when I'm there, I'm constantly assumed to be the help, right? And there's a reason for that. It's because I don't look like the white people who are there. Similarly, like going to like take care of elderly relatives, I'm assumed to be the caretaker a lot of the time. So there's like this constant, you know, that white space that I was speaking to is a constant for Jews of color in the community. And it's, for me, it feels like, are we willing to have an honest conversation or not? Are you willing to sort of own your positionality? And also like when I also like teach about this as well. And one of the things I try to frame it is like whiteness and race are shifting concepts, and they've shifted for many people, not just Jews. You know, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, you know, Irish people alongside Jews were some of the first people to be sort of racialized in the European context before colonialism was an external project, right? So we are in some ways actually, discrimination against Jews and Irish and other communities is foundational to white supremacy. At the same time, in this particular context, you're able to benefit from white supremacy if you're like a white Jewish person. Like working in Israel and Palestine, you know, in my documentary with the Israeli Black Panther movement, one of the things Reuven Abergel, who's the subject of that film, says is we're always advancing the struggle against the white rule. So like even in Israel, this is like a discussion. This is like a way that people, you know, Levanim is a term that like Jews of color will use to refer to white Jewish people. So for me, it's like, for me, often that response is I'm not white is a denial of an experience or a fact that's been presented. And if you're really genuinely like wanting to have an honest conversation, you need to have to like find a way to accept that fact or to not argue against it. And at the end of the day, if you want to separate yourself from whiteness, that might even be a good, healthy thing. I think we're trying to dismantle systematic oppression, right? And like identifying with systems of oppression, but we can't do it in a way that denies the truth or that silences people.
I think my colleagues on the panel today have handled it beautifully, and I don't want to be repetitious in anything they've said. I would just add a tactile comment to this. It's about privilege. Like if you're going to get wrapped around the white or not, okay, move it to the side. This is about privilege. You can take off your kippot, you can take off your talit and walk through the world and no one will say anything to you. I can't take this off. And that is how I just make it really clear to folks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I actually, if people will allow it, I want to ask one last question, which is actually, I'm going to group several questions together because they're all similar in that they're all sort of forward-looking, how can we help, what can we do kind of questions. So Caitlin Hayes, who was actually the first questioner of the evening, asks, how do you think we can best help Jews who have been denied Aliyah in Israel, but are also marginalized for being Jewish within their home communities? I think especially referring to Jews in Uganda and others, right, where this is the case. And then similarly, let's see, we have Aaron Kemmemer asks, how can white Jews in North America open up dialogue with other white Jews about pro-Palestinian struggles? And Gabby Rubenstein asks, could you share some advice for building community that centers marginalized Jews? And Michael Dickinson asked, and Michael Dickinson is a professor of African American history here at VCU. He asks, are there any other systemic ways you think that Black and Jewish communities, pardon the dichotomy, can unify to confront oppression beyond some of the examples already mentioned. So let's see if we can just sort of broadly address those questions to close it out for the evening.
I just want to speak very briefly to the one that I feel like I have a little bit of insight in. I will own, like most of the work that I do, well, of course, I am knowledgeable about Israel-Palestine and have many strong opinions. That is something that is not very close to the work that I'm doing right now. So so I don't feel able to answer that the way that others on this panel would be able to give you much better answers. But the work of creating a meaningful Black community, Black Jewish community, and centering marginalized Jewish identities is something I think very seriously about. I think, number one, it takes a commitment from the Jewish institutions to say that this is a priority and actually let that be a priority, not try to sort of control the narrative. A lot of the way that I try to work is a community engaged practice. There's some very phenomenal templates. There's a sort of a think tank at one of the universities not far from Toronto called the Tamarack Institute, and they do a lot of work. It's actually around like anti-poverty work, but they're templates for community engaged practice work in like any context of trying to bring marginalized voices to tables to center themselves in decision making and create for themselves. And I mean, one of the other things that I just want to name is supporting the organizations that are out there that are run by Jews of color. And there are phenomenal organizations all the way across, predominantly the US, not so much Canada yet. But, you know, just off the top of my head, Jews of Color Initiative is in the midst of a survey of the experiences of Jews of color in the US. You know, there's AMUD, the Jews of Color Torah Academy. These are just on the top of my head because I've been thinking about them. You know, but all over the country, there are just phenomenal organizations. Before shown recently, the new executive director is a Black Jewish woman. It's now a Black-led organization as well. And you have just so many places that are advancing this conversation in really meaningful ways and giving Jews of color of all sorts opportunities to plug into community. And you know, one of the wonderful things outside of like getting outside of sort of the legacy organizations centering and the Jewish community organizations centering voices is also like supporting the organizations that were created in order to center the voices and have that sort of lens on how Jewish work can happen in our communal spaces. And the last thing I'll say is I really think that every Jewish organization who cares about this should take the time to, there are so many wonderful people doing doing DEI work in Jewish spaces. Take the time to invest in somebody to come and like look at your community and say like, here are some glaring things I see that you could probably change now, and also to help you sort of set yourself along a path of momentum to continue to do that work. Those would be my big recommendations. There's all sorts of small ones, but those are the ones that I'm going to sort of lift up today.
Great, thank you.
I will take the question about how the communities, separate and overlapping, can work together to address oppression. I think with any initiative that you take on, whether it be housing or maternal morbidity, whatever it may be, it's centering the voices of lived experience and putting them at the table. And where you can, in a way that uplifts the voice of, in this case, Black Jewish voices, if we're working together because they're at that intersection, uplifting those voices without tokenizing those voices. I think that's really important. It means not only finding the one or two people and making sure that they're sitting at the table, but involve them at the table in a broader sense and really ask what you need. There's a concept in community health improvement, nothing for us without us, meaning not we're going to do this to those people or for those people. Really reframe that we are all in this community, and if we're going to work on criminal justice reform, then we need to center the folks who live that and include them as a partner in the discussion and the solution, not just someone or a group of people that we're doing something to as a project. And I think that there is a lot in the Jewish faith. I think there's a lot in the Black church and many other religions, as well as the Black community in general, that really sort of undergirds that kind of work. And that would be my place to start.
Just to quickly address the question about supporting communities that have been denied Aliyah, I think that one thing that I've noticed about this situation, specifically with the Ugandan Jewish community that was like denied ability to immigrate to Israel, is they actually have strong relationships with diaspora Jewish movements. So like the conservative movement, the reform movement are engaging with them a lot. And I think I would encourage folks to like ask, if you're part of a congregation, is there an initiative to like build relationships with emerging Jewish communities around the world? Like I know my congregation in the Bay Area has been supporting a lot of emerging Jewish communities in Latin America. And I think that there are ways to build relationships, and we have to remember not to try to impose our way of being Jewish on them when we do this. Because I'm a little weary when I'm like, when I hear, oh, we're gonna like convert them to our type of Judaism or whatever. Like we don't, that's the relationship is what it is, but we don't have to make them like us, right? For us to support them, but building relationships and to sort of use, if the state of Israel is failing or discriminating against these communities, we can step up as the diaspora and build solidarity and be there for each other. And that's what we've done for like the entirety of Jewish history, right? So, and we're in a moment where that's more possible than ever. And I would really encourage folks, like, if you're worried about Ugandan Jews, like, let's find a way to like build with them and also look at other communities that have experienced that. And to the more broad question about solidarity, we're in a moment right now, we've just kicked out Trump in the United States, very happy about that. But like white nationalism isn't going anywhere. And it's one place where I think Black and Jewish people have a really very clear shared fight. When you look at what happened in Charlottesville, pro-Confederate Proud Boys marching and saying Jews will not replace us. That is a very clear evidence of what the threat is. The people who are shooting up synagogues are very similar, if not the same, to the people who are shooting up mosques and Black churches and, Sikh like Gurdwaras and other communities. And I think it's just like committing to ourselves to fight for a world that we all want to live in together is a really, it's a lot harder than it is to just say, but it's like the only way forward for us. And when I hear people talk about the civil rights movement and Heschel and all this stuff, I'm like, well, we have an ability to fight side by side in a way that isn't paternalistic, but a shared mutual interest that we can be doing right now. So if you want to talk about that legacy, walk the walk and like join in this desperately needed fight against really just fascism that we're in this moment. And that's connected to housing struggle, that's connected to fighting for equality in all these different ways, and fighting climate change and like the many different myriad issues in front of us. But it's just to understand that we really do have a shared struggle, and no one is going to win alone.
Well, thank you so much for all of that to our wonderful speakers. Everyone, I hope back home can give a round of applause, even though I'm not seeing it. None of us are seeing it, but for Rebecca Pierce, Tema Smith, and Sherrina Gibson were amazing. And if your questions were not answered, please send me an email, send them an email. Would love to try to get to all of those. And so thank you to everyone and have a good night. And happy Purim this week. Bye-bye, everyone.